To my cousin Derek, I was just a boring desk clerk, his favorite punching bag. But the night he shoved a microphone into my hand, laughing as he asked if I had ever shot anyone, he never realized he had pulled the pin on a grenade. The aging Navy SEAL sitting 3 tables away, the man I once dragged back from death, was about to ensure the explosion buried Derek's empire forever. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Sarah Soto. I am 34 years old, and I was currently suffocating in a high-necked silk blouse under the brutal, unforgiving sun of Sedona, Arizona. It was my younger sister's wedding weekend, an extravagant, overpriced affair draped against the towering red rocks. The resort was a masterclass in desert luxury, a place where people paid thousands of dollars a night to pretend they were connecting with nature while sipping imported champagne. The air was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and the even thicker stench of forced, artificial family cheer. To my relatives, I was exactly what my beige, conservative wardrobe suggested a ghost. I was the fiercely bland, painfully single administrative drone of the family. Whenever an aunt or uncle bothered to ask what I did for a living, I would give them my carefully rehearsed lie. I worked for the Peripheral Logistics Analysis Agency. I told them I spent 40 hours a week auditing supply chain spreadsheets and approving requisition forms for office supplies. Their eyes would glaze over within 10 seconds, and they would quickly find an excuse to walk away. It was the perfect camouflage. No one ever asked what peripheral logistics actually meant. If they had, I would have had to explain that it involved coordinating air support and exfiltration routes for Tier 1 operators trapped deep behind enemy lines. I liked being invisible. But camouflage only works if the predator is actually looking for prey. My cousin Derek was only ever looking for a mirror. Derek arrived at the resort on Friday afternoon, bringing the chaotic, aggressive noise of Austin, Texas, with him. He was a tech millionaire, the self-proclaimed golden boy of the extended family, and a man who treated every room he entered like a stage built specifically for his ego. He stepped out of a rented luxury vehicle wearing a designer linen suit, his voice carrying over the tranquil courtyard as he loudly barked orders at the valet. Derek did not just attend family gatherings, he sponsored them with his arrogance. He had recently sold a software startup for what he claimed was tens of millions of dollars, and he made sure everyone within a 5-mile radius knew it. Throughout the afternoon, Derek buzzed through the wedding guests like a hyperactive hornet. He cornered the groom's family by the open bar, loudly bragging about his latest angel investment in a private security firm. He dropped names of senators and corporate titans he had supposedly dined with, turning a family celebration into his personal networking event. He had a specific, cruel tactic for establishing social dominance. He elevated himself by standing on the shoulders of the quietest person in the room. Naturally, I was his favorite stepping stone. While we stood by the infinity pool, he balanced a crystal cocktail glass in one hand and pointed at me with the other. "Look at Sarah," Derek laughed, nudging my uncle. "I swear she has not changed her hairstyle in 15 years. Tell them about your thrilling week. Sarah, did you find a typo in a logistics report? Did the agency run out of toner?" The relatives chuckled politely. I offered a mild, compliant smile. I let him talk over me, using my engineered dullness as a blank canvas for his stories about big game hunting in South Africa and his exclusive, high-stakes investments. I just stood there, holding a glass of club soda, projecting the absolute harmlessness of a woman who had never seen the world outside a cubicle. The stifling atmosphere reached its absolute boiling point during the rehearsal dinner that evening. The banquet hall was a sea of glittering chandeliers, clinking silverware, and forced laughter. After the main course of dry-aged steak, Derek tapped his fork against his champagne flute. He stood at the head of the room, completely hijacking the spotlight from the bride and groom. His toast began with a few empty platitudes about love, but within 2 minutes, He pivoted to his favorite subject himself, and by extension, his favorite punchline, me. "It is all about taking risks," Derek announced into the microphone, pacing the floor like a cheap motivational speaker. "You have to seize life by the throat. You cannot just hide behind a desk your whole life. Right, Sarah." He turned, locking his eyes on my table. A hush fell over the room as the spotlight shifted. Over 100 pairs of eyes turned toward me. "I mean, look at her," Derek continued, his voice echoing loudly through the speakers. "She is 34, wearing a cardigan to a gala, and probably thinks a paper cut is a severe injury. I am out there dealing with real sharks, and she is counting paper clips." The crowd erupted into uneasy laughter. Derek fed on it. He walked slowly toward my table, a malicious, triumphant grin spreading across his face. He loved this. He loved making me feel microscopic so he could feel like a giant. He stopped right across from me, leaning over the white tablecloth, the microphone gripped tightly in his hand. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to flush red, to stutter, to shrink down into my chair in front of the entire family. To land the ultimate joke, he leaned in, his voice dripping with condescending pity, and boomed into the mic for the entire hall to hear. "Tell us, Sarah, have you ever shot anyone?" The laughter peaked, and then quickly died out, leaving a thick, uncomfortable silence in the air. Everyone waited for my ultimate humiliation. I did not blink. I reached for my water glass, the condensation cool against my steady fingertips. I brought the rim to my lips, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it back down on the linen tablecloth with a soft thud. I looked up, meeting his arrogant gaze with eyes that had seen the horrors of the Aden Gulf. "Only if they aim at Valkyrie first," I replied softly. The name hung in the air for barely a second before a violent, guttural hacking shattered the silence. It sounded as if someone were drowning on dry land. 3 tables away, Marcus Vance, the groom's godfather, lurched forward, violently choking on his drink. His elbow caught his crystal goblet, sending it crashing onto the immaculate white table linen. A pool of dark red wine bled rapidly across the fabric, looking uncomfortably like a fresh wound. Marcus was not a man who startled easily. He was a retired Navy SEAL, a man whose face looked as though it had been carved from weathered granite. He possessed the quiet, imposing stillness of someone who had spent his youth swimming in freezing oceans and sleeping in the dirt. Yet, at this moment, the color had completely drained from his rugged face, leaving behind a sickening ashen gray. He coughed fiercely into his napkin, his broad chest heaving, but his eyes never once darted to the spilled wine or his panicked wife. His piercing, hyper-focused gaze was locked entirely on me. The murmurs of concern from the surrounding guests morphed into a frantic buzz. His wife grabbed his arm, asking if he was all right, if he needed a doctor. Marcus did not even look at her. He shoved her hands away with a frantic, uncharacteristic roughness. He stood up so quickly that his heavy wooden chair tipped over backwards, slamming against the hardwood floor with a deafening crack. The entire banquet hall held its collective breath. Marcus ignored the 200 guests staring at him. He bypassed the terrified waiters and marched straight toward my table. His steps were unsteady, lacking his usual military precision. His large, calloused hands were visibly trembling as he stopped just inches from where Derek stood, frozen with the microphone. "You," Marcus breathed, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying a raw, scraped edge that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Say that name again. Tell me you did not just say that name." I remained perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on my lap. I held his gaze, recognizing the frantic, haunted look of a man who had left a piece of his soul in a desert 6 years ago. "Valkyrie," I said, my voice steady, lowering my pitch to the exact tone I used over encrypted radio channels. "Gulf of Aden, Extraction Point Delta. The air was thick, and the water was hot. You had 2 men down, and the sky was completely blind." Marcus's knees buckled slightly. He grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. His knuckles turning white, he let out a ragged gasp, a sound that held years of survivors' guilt and buried trauma. "It was you," Marcus choked out, tears suddenly welling in eyes that had probably not cried in decades. "They told us it was a woman on the comms. You designed the strike. You threaded the needle through a sandstorm and brought the bird down exactly when the perimeter collapsed. You saved my boys. You brought us home." The silence that blanketed the room was absolute, thick, and suffocating. No one moved. No one breathed. The family members who had spent the last decade pitying my boring life were now staring at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. Then, Derek ruined it. Incapable of tolerating a room where he was not the center of gravity, Derek let out a loud, forced laugh. It was a harsh, ugly sound that violently disrupted the sacred moment. "Oh, come on," Derek sneered, waving his free hand dismissively. "Marcus, buddy, I think you have had one too many glasses of Cabernet. Or maybe you are confusing my boring little cousin with a late-night action movie. She audits staplers for a living. She does not even know how to play a video game, let alone call in a military strike." Derek raised the microphone to his lips again, ready to deliver another punchline, ready to drag the reality back into his carefully constructed, artificial world. He never got the chance. Marcus snapped. The trembling, emotional veteran vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced instantly by the lethal, apex predator he had been trained to be. Marcus spun around, closing the distance between him and Derek in a single, terrifying stride. He did not hit my cousin. He did not need to. Marcus simply stepped into Derek's personal space, towering over him, his chest completely puffed out, projecting an aura of pure, unfiltered violence. "Shut your mouth," Marcus roared. It was not a request. It was a command issued from the depths of a battlefield. The sheer acoustic force of his voice hit Derek like a physical blow. The microphone slipped from Derek's sweaty fingers, letting out a sharp screech of feedback as it hit the floor. Derek shrank back, his designer suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big, his arrogant smirk melting into pure, unadulterated terror. "If you ever disrespect this woman again," Marcus growled, his voice low and vibrating with a lethal promise, "if you ever speak to her with that tone, I will personally show you what a real shark looks like. Do you understand me?" Derek could not speak. He could only manage a frantic, pathetic nod, his eyes wide with fear. The tension in the room was a taut wire ready to snap. I looked at the bride's table. My sister was pale, her hands covering her mouth, the joy of her rehearsal dinner entirely hijacked by this explosive confrontation. This was her weekend, not mine. I had spent years hiding in the shadows precisely to avoid collateral damage like this. Without a single word, I pushed my chair back. The scrape of the wood against the floor sounded like a gunshot in the dead silent room. I picked up my clutch, gave Marcus a brief, acknowledging nod, and walked away from the table. I moved with purposeful, quiet steps, passing by the staring, open-mouthed faces of my relatives. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto the cool, dark balcony, leaving behind a shattered illusion and a room full of people drowning in 1,000 unasked questions. The desert night air was a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the banquet hall. I stood by the stone railing of the balcony, letting the absolute darkness of the canyon wash over me. The sliding glass door clicked open, and heavy, measured footsteps approached. Marcus did not say a word at first. He just stood beside me, staring out into the pitch-black horizon. "I lost 3 good men before you got on the radio that night," Marcus said, his voice stripped of the explosive rage from earlier, leaving only a hollow exhaustion. "We were pinned down in a compound for 48 hours. The extraction zone was compromised. We thought we were dead." "You had civilians to protect," I replied, my tone flat, slipping effortlessly back into the clinical detachment of a tactical analyst. "The enemy forces had you outnumbered 5-1. My job was to clear a path. You did the heavy lifting." Marcus shook his head, rolling his left shoulder. "I took a piece of shrapnel the size of a golf ball during that final push. The doctors told me I would never use this arm again, but I lived, because you saw a blind spot in their mortar positions and routed us through a canyon that was not even on the official maps. We stood in a shared silence, honoring the ghosts of that operation, but we were not entirely alone. In the reflection of the glass door, I caught the faint outline of a figure lingering in the shadows of the hallway. Derek. He had followed us out. Any normal person would have felt a crushing wave of shame overhearing the raw, unfiltered truth of a combat veteran, but my cousin was practically pathologically narcissistic. To a man who faked success for a living, everything was a performance. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. In his twisted reality, there was zero chance his boring, spinster cousin was actually a covert military asset. He firmly believed I had somehow paid Marcus to stage this dramatic intervention, a pathetic, desperate play to steal his spotlight. The next morning, at the farewell brunch, Derek put his delusional theory into action. He swaggered over to the buffet line, holding a mimosa and sporting a grin that was entirely too bright. "Well, if it isn't our very own tactical mastermind," Derek announced loudly, making sure the nearby relatives could hear. "Listen, Sarah, I am hosting a massive charity gala at my estate in Austin on the 28th of this month. We are launching an initiative called Tech for Peace. It is an exclusive networking event for defense contractors and private security firms." He leaned in, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. "Since you are such a decorated hero, you absolutely have to come. I will even introduce you to some real, high-level military experts. We can put your little agency on the map. It will be the perfect stage for you to share your war stories." It was a transparent trap. He wanted to parade me in front of actual industry professionals to humiliate me, to expose my supposed lie on his home turf. My immediate instinct was to politely decline and disappear back to headquarters. "I think my schedule is fully booked," I said, turning away to pick up a coffee cup. "Oh, come on, do not tell me you are intimidated," Derek mocked, aggressively pulling a glossy leather-bound prospectus from his briefcase and slamming it onto the table. "Look at the guest list. These are heavy hitters, guys who move hundreds of millions of dollars in global assets. You might actually learn something." I sighed, lowering my eyes to the open page just to appease him. My gaze swept over the roster of Silicon Valley investors, retired generals, and politicians. Then, my eyes locked onto a single name printed near the bottom of the Platinum Sponsors list. Elias Thorne. My blood turned to ice, though my expression remained perfectly blank. Elias Thorne was not a tech investor. He was a ghost. He was the invisible architect of a global underground arms smuggling syndicate that my agency had spent the last 3 years trying to dismantle. He moved illegal munitions through shell companies, funding wars and supplying cartels. We had no photos of him, no known addresses, and zero actionable intel on his movements. And here was my idiot cousin, bragging about having him over for cocktails. The family drama completely vanished from my mind, instantly replaced by the cold, calculating geometry of a federal sting operation. "You know what, Derek," I said, looking up with a perfectly compliant smile. "You are right. It sounds like an educational evening. I would be honored to attend." Derek beamed, thoroughly convinced he had just secured his ultimate victory. He walked away, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just handed me the master key to the largest criminal investigation of my career. Within 10 minutes, I was locked inside my rental car, speaking into a heavily encrypted satellite phone. I bypassed my regional supervisor and connected directly to the Central Command Director. I outlined the situation, the target, and the venue. The objective was no longer about surviving a family gathering. The luxurious gala in Austin was about to become the epicenter of a massive, covert tactical strike, and I was going to be the bait. The glass mansion in the hills of Austin was a monument to new money and fragile egos. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, while inside, geometric chandeliers cast a harsh, glittering light over hundreds of guests. The air hummed with the sound of a string quartet playing a classical rendition of a popular song, entirely drowned out by the clatter of crystal champagne flutes and the hollow laughter of the tech elite. It was a gala designed to project philanthropy, a brilliant facade for tax evasion and corporate vanity. Beneath the scent of expensive truffles and imported lilies, the atmosphere carried a sharp, metallic edge, like the ozone smell just before a lightning strike. The tension was a tightly coiled spring, waiting for the slightest pressure to snap. I stepped through the grand double doors wearing a floor-length, razor-sharp black evening gown. It was a stark departure from the beige cardigans and oversized blouses my family was accustomed to seeing me in. My hair was tightly swept up into an intricate twist, a deliberate stylistic choice that perfectly concealed the micro receiver resting deep inside my right ear canal. Through that tiny device, the steady, synthesized voice of command dispatch fed me continuous audio updates on perimeter security and satellite surveillance. I was no longer a compliant guest walking into a family function. I was a weapon locking onto its target. Derek spotted me almost immediately. He was holding court near the center of the main ballroom, wearing a bespoke velvet tuxedo. His face lit up with the predatory thrill of a spider watching a fly land on its web. He navigated through the crowd, grabbed my elbow with a firm, patronizing grip, and steered me away from the general admission area. He led me directly toward the elevated VIP section, an exclusive circular booth enclosed by velvet ropes and guarded by men who looked entirely too comfortable in their tailored suits. "I am so glad you could make it, Sarah," Derek practically purred, gesturing for me to take the empty seat precisely in the center of the arrangement. "I want you to meet the real heavyweights. These gentlemen are not shuffling paperwork. They manage global stability." He was intentionally boxing me in, placing me under the harsh spotlight of his engineered stage. I took my seat and briefly scanned the faces at the table. To my left sat two broad-shouldered men with the unmistakable rigid posture and scanning eyes of former private military contractors, but my attention was immediately anchored to the man sitting directly across from me. Elias Thorne. He did not look like an international arms dealer. He looked like an aging venture capitalist. He wore a silver silk tie and casually swirled an amber liquid in a low-ball glass. His face was deeply tanned, his silver hair perfectly styled. There were no photographs of him in the agency database, only composite sketches compiled from whispers in the criminal underworld. Yet the cold, dead calculation in his eyes matched the profile of a man who profited from global slaughter. "Gentlemen," Derek announced, raising his glass to command the table's attention, "I would like to introduce my cousin, Sarah. She works in an administrative capacity for the government, but apparently, if you catch her on the right night, she will tell you she is actually a covert tactical genius who calls in military strikes. I thought it would be incredibly entertaining to have her share some of her classified war stories with men who have actually seen combat." Derek leaned back, crossing his arms, waiting for the slaughter. He expected me to crumble, to stutter, to finally confess my pathetic lies in front of his billionaire friends. The two former military contractors smirked, exchanging amused, condescending glances. Thorne did not smile. He simply watched me with mild, polite boredom. "Go ahead, Sarah," Derek goaded, his voice dripping with malice. "Enlighten Mr. Thorne. Tell him how you single-handedly fight terrorism from your cubicle." The string quartet hit a high, dramatic crescendo in the background. I kept my posture perfectly straight, letting the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds. I did not blush. I did not look away. I reached out, picked up a silver dessert fork, and gently tapped it against my water glass. "I do not tell war stories. Derek," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, cutting cleanly through the ambient noise of the party. "I analyze logistics. Specifically, I look for inefficiencies and anomalies in global supply chains. For instance, I have been reviewing the public freight manifests for your new tech initiative. You claim to be shipping modular water purification systems to developing nations." Derek frowned, entirely confused by the sudden pivot. "What are you talking about? This is a charity gala, not a board meeting." "I am talking about cargo volume," I continued, leaning forward slightly, keeping my eyes locked on Elias Thorne. Your purification units have a stated weight of 250 pounds per crate. Yet, the shipping logs from your chartered vessels out of the port of Houston show those exact crates weighing in at over 800 pounds. Furthermore, your routing protocols are highly inefficient. Your ships deliberately drop their automatic identification system transponders for 48 hours while navigating through the Mediterranean. The smirks on the faces of the military contractors instantly vanished. Their postures stiffened. "That is a standard communication blackout," Derek stammered, his face flushing with irritation, trying to maintain control of the narrative. "It is a satellite glitch. You do not know anything about maritime shipping." I know that a communication blackout in Sector 7 of the Adriatic Sea aligns perfectly with the coordinates of unregulated offshore transfer vessels, I stated coldly, dropping my voice an octave. I know that heavy crates shielded with lead lining are used to bypass thermal imaging scanners at customs checkpoints. And I know that the specific encryption key your company uses to authorize these blind drops is identical to the routing architecture favored by a syndicate moving military-grade ordnance into conflict zones. The air at the table turned to solid ice. Derek looked around, desperately seeking backup, but no one was looking at him anymore. The two mercenaries were staring at me in absolute, undisguised horror. The terminology I was using, the precise tactical understanding of darkwater maritime smuggling, it was impossible for an outsider to know. It was classified, top-tier intelligence. "I also noticed the payment routing," I added, my voice smooth and unrelenting. "You use a decentralized ledger to bounce payments through 7 different offshore banks before the money lands in a shell company based in Cyprus, a shell company that, coincidentally, filed for bankruptcy 3 days after a massive cache of assault rifles was discovered in a warehouse in Odessa." "Who are you?" one of the contractors whispered, his hand instinctively twitching toward the inside breast pocket of his tuxedo. "Sit completely still," I ordered softly, delivering the command with the absolute authority of a lead operator. Elias Thorne slowly lowered his glass to the table. The polite boredom was gone, replaced by the lethal, hyper-vigilant stare of a cornered predator. He realized exactly what was happening. His empire, hidden behind layers of corporate shells and idiot proxies like my cousin, had just been entirely compromised from the inside out. The ambient chatter of the ballroom suddenly dropped out. The music screeched to a halt as the cellist fumbled a note. A strange, suffocating wave of quiet washed over the extravagant party. I glanced past Thorne's shoulder toward the main entrance. The massive glass doors had been pushed open. Standing directly in the center of the threshold was Marcus Vance. He was not wearing a tuxedo. He wore a dark tactical jacket, and his eyes were locked entirely on our table. Beside him stood 6 individuals with the same hardened, unforgiving expressions, their hands resting casually near their waistbands. With chilling, synchronized precision, they fanned out, systematically blocking the main doors, the terrace exits, and the kitchen corridors. They did not draw their weapons, but they did not need to. The trap had been successfully sprung, and the heavy steel jaws were rapidly closing shut. The low murmurs at the VIP table began to ripple outward, infecting the adjacent tables like a virus. The elite investors, men and women whose entire empires relied on calculated risk and pristine public images, leaned away from Derek. Their whispers were sharp, frantic, calculating the immediate collateral damage of the accusations I had just laid bare. Derek noticed the shift instantly. His face contorted, flushing a deep, angry crimson that clashed horribly with his velvet tuxedo. His chest heaved, his fragile ego fracturing under the weight of the sudden, suffocating scrutiny. Unable to process the reality of the situation, he reverted to his baseline instinct, attacking the easiest target. "You are out of your mind," Derek shouted, his voice cracking, projecting loudly enough to echo off the vaulted glass ceiling. He slammed his open palm against the table, rattling the crystal glasses. "Do not listen to her. She is delusional. She has always been jealous of me, of our family's success. She sits in a miserable little cubicle all day, reading spy novels and making up these pathetic fantasies to ruin my business. He pointed a trembling finger at my face, his upper lip coated in a thin sheen of nervous sweat. You are nothing. Sarah, you are a nobody trying to play make-believe at a table of adults. Security is going to drag you out of here. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his hysterics. Instead, I let a cold, razor-thin smile touch the corners of my mouth. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Elias Thorne, bypassing my cousin as if he were nothing more than a minor atmospheric disturbance. Transaction Alpha 79er-Delta 4, I recited, my voice perfectly level, enunciating every syllable with the calculated precision of a metronome. Routing sequence initiating through the Cayman Islands, bouncing to a secure offshore holding, and terminating at a dark web ledger. Amount transferred $12,400,000. Timestamp exactly 10 minutes ago. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. You routed that payment using the encrypted server cluster located in the basement of this very house, masking the origin under a fake invoice for philanthropic logistics. A very sloppy move. Elias, my team intercepted the handshake protocol before the first digital packet even left Texas. Elias Thorne stopped breathing. The color drained completely from his deeply tanned face, leaving a sickly, waxy pallor behind. His eyes, previously masked by a veneer of polite indifference, widened in sheer, unadulterated shock. He stared at me not as a boring administrative clerk, but as the grim reaper of his criminal empire. In that singular fraction of a second, he realized the agonizing truth. The phantom agency that had been systematically severing his supply lines, dismantling his cartels, and freezing his shadow accounts for the last 3 years was not an untraceable military task force. It was the woman sitting across from him in a black evening gown. Thorne did not speak. He did not deny the accusation. Instead, he dropped his gaze to the table and gave a barely perceptible nod to the 2 massive bodyguards standing just outside the velvet ropes. They moved instantly. They were professionals, men trained to eliminate threats quickly and quietly. They unbuttoned their suit jackets, their hands reaching for the concealed weapons at their waists as they stepped rapidly toward my chair. But they never made it past the ropes. Marcus Vance and his tactical unit collapsed the perimeter with terrifying speed. There was no shouting. There were no warning shots. It was a masterclass in silent, kinetic violence. Before Thorne's lead bodyguard could even clear his weapon from its holster, Marcus was there. He gripped the man's wrist, applying a brutal torque that snapped the joint, while simultaneously driving a knee upward into the guard's solar plexus. The bodyguard crumpled instantly, his breath leaving his lungs in a muted gasp. Simultaneously, the second bodyguard was intercepted by 2 of Marcus's former teammates. One operator swept the guard's legs out from under him, while the other applied a synchronized sleeper hold, dragging him down to the carpeted floor. The entire engagement lasted less than 4 seconds. The 2 massive threats were neutralized and pinned to the ground with zip ties before the surrounding guests even realized a physical altercation had taken place. Derek stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of a chair. His eyes darted wildly from the incapacitated men on the floor to the cold, unyielding faces of Marcus and his team. Total panic set in. The carefully constructed reality he had lived in for years was disintegrating before his eyes, and his brain simply refused to compute the incoming data. "What are you doing?" Derek shrieked, his voice climbing an octave, waving his hands frantically at the other investors who were now actively backing away from the table. "This is a misunderstanding. Please, stay calm. This is just a massive mistake. She is crazy. These guys are crazy." Right on cue, the ambient lights in the ballroom cut out, plunging the space into temporary darkness. A collective gasp echoed through the crowd. A second later, the massive wall-to-wall digital projection screens that had been displaying the elegant logo of Derek's company flared back to life, but the logo was gone. In its place, projected in brilliant, high-definition white against a stark blue background, was the official seal of the Department of Justice. Beneath the seal, a massive wall of text began to scroll. The letters large enough for everyone in the room to read clearly. It was a federal indictment. Derek's full legal name was plastered across the top, followed by a list of charges that read like a criminal masterclass: conspiracy to commit international money laundering, wire fraud, providing material support to sanctioned entities. The screens displayed live feeds of his offshore bank accounts, the balances flashing rapidly as they hit zero, stamped with bright red banners that read, "Assets frozen by federal mandate." The string quartet had long since stopped playing. The only sound in the cavernous hall was the ragged, panicked hyperventilation of a tech millionaire realizing that his life, his fortune, and his freedom had just been completely erased. Elias Thorne was a man who had built an empire on survival. Confronted with the absolute destruction of his syndicate and the freezing of his assets, his polite facade completely evaporated, leaving only a cornered animal. The federal mandate flashing on the screens was his death sentence, but he was not going to let a government agent take him quietly. His eyes darted across the room, calculating the angles, the exits, and the vulnerabilities. He found his perfect shield in the pathetic, blubbering mess standing right next to him. In a fraction of a second, Thorne reached into the lining of his suit jacket and drew a compact, ceramic pistol, a weapon specifically designed to evade metal detectors. He lunged forward, wrapping his thick arm around Derek's throat and jamming the muzzle of the gun violently against my cousin's temple. Derek let out a high-pitched, agonizing scream, his hands frantically clawing at Thorne's arm. The remaining guests in the ballroom shrieked and scrambled backward, tripping over chairs in a desperate stampede to get away from the weapon. "Back off," Thorne roared, his voice feral and completely unrecognizable. He pressed the barrel harder against Derek's skull, using my paralyzed cousin as a human shield. "Everyone stay exactly where you are, or I blow his brains all over this expensive carpet." Marcus and his men instantly drew their weapons, aiming directly at Thorne, but they held their fire. The angle was too tight, the risk of collateral damage too high. Thorne made a fatal miscalculation. He thought I was just an analyst. He thought I would freeze. I shifted my weight, stepping back half a beat to drop beneath his line of sight. Muscle memory, forged in the blood-soaked training grounds of the agency, took over completely. I pivoted sharply, driving my open palm in a vicious, upward strike directly into the radial nerve of Thorne's gun hand. The impact was precise and devastating. Thorne's fingers spasmed, releasing the weapon before he could even process the pain. I did not stop moving, in one fluid, continuous motion. I grabbed his wrist, twisted his arm into a brutal, hyperextended joint lock, and swept my heel behind his knee. The physics were undeniable. Thorne crashed onto the hard floor with a sickening thud. His arm pinned painfully behind his back. I pressed my knee firmly against his spine, completely immobilizing the international warlord. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 seconds. Before Thorne could even gasp for air, the heavy glass doors of the mansion were blown violently off their hinges. A massive squad of heavily armored federal tactical agents flooded into the ballroom. They moved like a tidal wave of black Kevlar and assault rifles, their tactical boots thundering against the floorboards. The lead commander, a burly man with a radio strapped to his chest, marched straight past the cowering billionaires and stopped directly in front of me. "Status, Agent Soto?" the commander asked, his voice echoing loudly in the stunned silence of the room. "Target secured," I replied coldly, standing up and smoothing out the fabric of my black evening gown. "Take him into custody, secure the servers in the basement, and bag every document in this building." "Yes, ma'am," the commander barked, signaling 2 agents to haul Thorne away. The family members who had been invited to witness my ultimate humiliation were standing completely frozen. My aunts, my uncles, the people who had spent the last decade mocking my boring, administrative life, stared at me in absolute, terrified awe. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The quiet, invisible girl they had constantly trampled on was a terrifying, lethal gatekeeper of the global underworld. Across the room, an agent grabbed Derek by the collar, hauling him roughly to his feet. Derek's legs could not support his own weight. He collapsed to his knees, openly sobbing as the cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. His luxury mansion, his stolen millions, his arrogant facade. Everything he had built by stepping on others was completely crushed into dust in a single night. Marcus Vance walked slowly over to where my cousin was kneeling. The veteran looked down at the weeping millionaire, a cold, satisfied smirk spreading across his weathered face. "I told you," Marcus said, his voice low and uncompromising. "Never ask Valkyrie that question unless you are ready to see her pull the trigger." I did not stay to watch them drag Derek out. I turned my back on the shattered ballroom and walked toward the exit. As I reached the doorway, I heard the faint, desperate voices of my relatives calling out to me, offering frantic, belated apologies. I ignored them completely. I stepped out into the cool night air, walking down the grand driveway illuminated entirely by the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers, leaving the ruins of Derek's empire far behind me. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Maya Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.